can get started. All right, there it goes. All right, so today is the end of Chapter 4 and the end of Unit 1. Take a quick look at the syllabus. Hopefully it's still sharing. Yep. So today we are covering Chapter 4. We're going to have an in-class activity around attachment. So hopefully that's fun. And hopefully we have enough students. There's enough for 2 small groups right now. Hopefully we get more students coming in very soon. And then your exam will open basically just after midnight tonight. So it's open all day Friday and then all day Saturday. It closes just before midnight on Saturday. Again, there's 90 minutes to take the exam, 60 questions, all multiple choice, very similar, and some questions even the same as you see on your study guide. So hopefully you've been studying up or even having study groups in between now and then. So yeah, hopefully we do finish Chapter 4 a little early today so we can do a little bit of review together. But if not, feel free to send me emails. If you're working on the study guide and you're like, hey, I really don't understand number 8, I think it could be B or C, let me know and I can send you the answer to 1 or 2 questions. I won't send out like a answer sheet for the whole thing. But if you are struggling with a couple of the questions, let me know. And like maybe 1 to 3 questions, I could answer those. And if it seems like a lot of people are asking those, I'll send a class-wide email. So hopefully you feel prepared and less stressed. And the study guide is really the exact same format. Those multiple choice questions are the exact same format that you'll see on the exam. So I hope you don't have too much test anxiety from that. I know that's generally, students know the material pretty well, but for the first exam, usually it's stress that leads to lower grades. So do what you need to calm down, meditate before the exam. It's usually best to study up to about when you're going to take it, but then take a little break in between. So whether that's like driving to some place to then get better Wi-Fi to take the exam, or watching a show or eating a meal or meditating. Do take a little break after cramming for the exam before you actually take it to de-stress a little bit, or whatever you know works for you. All right, because it's not a super difficult exam. Students just are always anxious with the first exam. They don't know what it's going to be like, so hopefully the study guide lets you know what it's going to be like. And I'll stop talking about it so it doesn't increase your stress more. So let's jump into Chapter 4. Are there any questions about the logistics of the exam, though? I know we've talked about it a couple times, so hopefully that's clear to everyone. But definitely type anything in the comments or raise your hand and ask any questions if you need. All right, so the first thing we'll talk about today is temperament. In this class, I don't think we covered any of the temperaments. We didn't quite have time. But basically, you can think of temperament as like infant personality. So how do they kind of behave overall across different contexts? So there's 3 different types: easy child, difficult child, and slow to warm up. So easy child, one of the things is that they're generally in a positive mood. But the big key difference here that makes them an easy child is that they're quick to establish routines, and then they're really good at reestablishing routines if you change context. So they can quickly change. Let's say you take your infant from home where they have a really good schedule, they're sleeping at a certain amount or like at the same times every day, like they've got a well-established pattern, they're feeding at the same times every day. Take them to grandma's house for a weekend visit or something, an easy child would be able to really quickly get back in that schedule. The first day might be a struggle possibly, but maybe the second day they're right back on their same schedule. So they quickly adapt and they quickly establish routines. Versus a difficult child, acts more negatively and cries more frequently generally, but the big key difference here, because easy children obviously cry as well. They get hungry, they fuss and whatnot. So a difficult child, probably the best thing to determine this kind of personality difference between them is that their daily routines are more irregular. So it's harder to establish consistent routines. One day they're sleeping in 2 or 3 hour chunks. The next day they go 7 hours between sleeping. And so their schedule's really off and you never know when they're going to want to feed. And they're also very slow to adapt to change. So take the difficult child from home to grandma's house. It might be a lot harder experience for the parents. This is why they're called difficult child, because it can be difficult to do things and figure out the schedule. So for the parent, it's more difficult. That's why they were named this, basically. So with that, you take them to grandma's. It's harder to establish that new routine. They might not sleep very much. They might not eat enough or at their normal times. So that would be pretty clear signs of it being a difficult child, as we would characterize them with this temperament. Then slow to warm up child is generally a lower activity level. They don't do as much, so not as much like happy expressions or not as much sad expressions or crying. So it might be somewhat negative mood, but they also have a pretty low intensity of mood. You might call them boring. So if you met your nephew or niece and they didn't really do much, they didn't seem really excitable or too difficult to take care of, and you're just like, well, that baby was kind of boring, they might be a slow to warm up child. So with that, that's kind of how you can tell that difference. And these are just ways that scientists have categorized the temperament of infants to then compare it to things that happen later on in life. So what do you think might be the difference of having a difficult child versus an easy child in maybe the attachment to the child? Which one do you think would be a little more difficult or a little more easy to get a strong attachment to? So feel free to take over the mic or use the chat boxes.
I think it's probably to get easier to attach with an easy child because it's more approachable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so. And that tends to be some of the correlations that we see, is that for easier children, it's easier for the parents to feel warm towards them and not be as frustrated and then get that attachment. For a difficult child, it definitely is still possible to get that secure attachment and feel a lot of warmth for that infant. Most parents do generally, even if it is a difficult child. So with that being said, though, it can make it more difficult to do, like we were talking last time, being immediate responding, caring for their needs, things like that. It can be slower with a difficult child, and parents might be slower to do that with a difficult child. And here's another good comment, that a difficult child might get more attention. So you might be able to see that child being more attached. That is possible. That attention might be more warm and responsive, and if so, that would be great. But depending on the parents and the parents' personality and their times and stress levels, that attention also might not be positive. So it might not be as secure of an attachment. But yeah, it's a really good question. So if you think about temperament, think about it as one of those aspects of an individual. So that model that we saw where the child was like a circle and it was made up of different things like their biology, their personality. Think of temperament being one of those things, and that their type of temperament influences how the parent will then parent them. So they might pay them more attention or less attention, more positive attention or less positive attention, and that will change how that child then grows and develops over time. And so that's the big key here. I see another comment from Daniela. Go for it.
I have a friend that her cousin adopted a kid, a boy, and he's
Mm-hmm.
very difficult. Like he's very aggressive when the parents are not around. And he's
Mm-hmm.
probably like 6 or 7 now. But every time he has to babysit him, she has to babysit him. He always breaks something on her house. He yells at people. He keeps like jumping from one couch to the other. Like, but he makes like things on purpose to get the attention. And when she tells him not to do it, and he's gonna say, "Well, tell my parents they're not gonna do anything." And if
Mm-hmm.
she tells them, he's like, "Oh, poor thing, he's adopted. Let him be, just protect him." And like,
Mm-hmm.
when the parents are not around, like he's just like this evil child. So how do you deal with that?
That's a really good question. I think you can see a couple things with that. We haven't talked about parenting styles yet, but that sounds like a permissive parenting style, where essentially they're permitting their child to do whatever. And their reasoning for that, it sounds like, is because the child's adopted, so they want to give them a warm, supportive area. But with that being said, as we'll learn about in parenting styles, you need to be warm and supportive, but there also need to be rules and boundaries set as well. That's called authoritative parenting. So maybe suggesting, I mean, as the babysitter, if the parents aren't listening to them, I worked as a therapist with children who had similar behavior problems. And so they were literally coming to us for therapy to learn like what to do for their children. And some parents, unfortunately, just wouldn't do the things that we asked. So we would make progress with the children, take them home, be like, okay, over this weekend or while you're on this trip, make sure you're doing these things to keep up this progress. And there were some parents that did fantastic. And so their children improved their behaviors really quickly. But there were some parents who just wouldn't, who had a really hard time. So if you can't convince the parents to parent in a slightly different way or giving them techniques, maybe giving them a book on authoritative parenting, from a babysitter's standpoint, there's not much that you can do. So maybe just stop babysitting them and if they're breaking things in your house, because what the child needs is to have some different parenting. So they obviously maybe at home can have and maybe do have good behaviors. But authoritative parenting tends to be the best for most children. So you need the warmth and support, but also the boundaries being set as well at the same time. So maybe not a great answer, but especially as a babysitter of the child, it's hard for you to encourage the parents to change their behavior. And if they're not going to, and the child's still going to be breaking your house, you might need to consider whether watching that child is good for the household that you're in.
Yeah, she's about to quit, so I think that's the way she's going. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, she can definitely suggest to the parents that maybe some more authoritative parenting might be in order, and definitely make sure you get the word right because there's also authoritarian parenting, and they sound very similar. So authoritarian is high demands but low warmth, and so you don't want that. You could think of that being like an authoritarian dictator over the child. You can maybe make that connection. So it's not authoritarian, not just a bunch of demands but no warmth. A child needs warmth and the clear demands. And then there's, especially for a 6-year-old or a teenager, there's a lot of back and forth of, well, does this rule make sense? Why do we have this rule? That kind of thing. So authoritative generally is one of the more positive parenting styles. So yeah, that's really tough for your friend, especially as a babysitter. I feel that pain. That's one of the reasons I got burnt out of doing that kind of therapy is parents who wouldn't do the skills that we were teaching them. It was frustrating, but it was also really neat to see and really inspiring to see children improve in their behaviors or capacities so quickly when they had other people in their school or community or home, especially because we worked with schools, people in the communities that they would work with, like maybe scout masters or religious leaders or things like that, as well as the families to share like, hey, this is what this child is needing support for. And when they had that support, it was really amazing to see how quickly a child could change their behavior or build their skills when they had those outside contexts influencing in a positive way. So it's not all bad working with kids, that's for sure. And there was a comment earlier that I just kept reading on, so sorry about that. It's a squeaky wheel that gets the grease, and you can see that with children from orphanages as well. Yeah, especially in an orphanage kind of setting, and many foster homes where there's many foster children, that to get attention, to get any kind of care and concern, attention really, and it's not always warmth either, that having worse behaviors can be adaptive for the child. So it's not that the child is wanting to be bad or it's a bad child. It's the behaviors of breaking things might be getting them something that they're not otherwise getting. So it is reinforcing in some ways. It's adaptive in some way. So kids do what works. They learn to do what works to get them what they need in life, essentially. So that's what they do. So really good question, really good comments. Hopefully, I mean, we're talking about slightly older children with that example, but it's definitely relevant to temperament here. There's other temperaments that behavioral inhibition might play a bigger role than these kind of overarching personality kind of traits. And so shy, subdued, or timid child, or a sociable, extroverted, bold child. So that's a couple kind of traits that a child might have and might lead them to interact with people differently. So a sociable or extroverted infant might get more interactions with people, build that skill, versus a subdued or timid child might not. So with that, inhibited children do seem to have a higher risk for developing anxiety disorders. But again, that's some correlational studies. You can't necessarily do an experiment that tests that, but you can do longitudinal studies to see if that does follow and get some causal data. So another big part of infants and early childhood is this effortful control. So you see this child here looking at the hamburger, and you may have heard of the marshmallow experiment, that in early childhood you give a child one marshmallow. Oh, I see another question here. Sorry about that. Go for it, Daniela.
Sorry, I was just gonna make a comment because
Yeah.
I remember being a very shy child, and I do have depression and anxiety now, so I had to take medication for anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah,
because
and so that is one thing that could be correlated with that, those traits early in childhood. And so the reason that a developmental scientist would want to know that is so that in childhood, if there's something that is suggestive of a risk factor for later on depression and anxiety, maybe doing something to treat it early on, and help support the child, get them some other skills so that they can maybe interact with others a little better. So that would be a good thing to do. But you can also do that in early childhood and adolescence and adulthood as well, with treatment. So.
yeah, because like since I'm a twin, I always had my best friend with me all the time, so I didn't have to look for friends.
Mm-hmm.
And once we started like the school age, they put us in separate classes, and I
Mm.
could just see her at lunchtime, and like I wouldn't talk to anyone like around me. I would wait until lunchtime to talk to her.
Mm-hmm.
And so like growing up, like I was never the one that was looking for friends because I always had my best friend with me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that makes perfect sense, especially since we usually talk about attachment in the sense of a parent, like a caregiver and a child, but that attachment between a close sibling, especially a twin, and a child would be really important too, and could lead to that. I mean, clinging sounds like a bad word, but it's just kind of a descriptive word here. Um, so I'm not saying it like in any kind of valence or judgment way, but like that attachment to a sibling uh, could make it easy to, because it's easier to have those kinds of conversations and rely on someone versus building it with someone new. And so that could definitely, when there's such a strong connection there, I could definitely see how that would make it harder to reach out to other people. So something that if you have twins or you know someone who has twins, and that goes for anyone in the class, to let them be aware of and maybe watch for, to make sure that their children can develop skills, that so like socializing, things like that, maybe more play dates, maybe play dates separately, things like that, especially for twins. So I know during the pandemic that's really hard. You don't necessarily want to be sending your kids to other people's houses or have other kids coming to your houses. So that's one thing we've struggled with our youngest, who would have probably started preschool this year, had it not been for all of this. So yeah, really good examples, and it really shows the context working, or so the situations around one individual. So you might have had those more timid traits, and then plus a strong attachment with a sibling, and then having maybe less support in the school years, versus if you had a little bit more support, maybe things would have turned out slightly differently. So how all those different contextual pieces can it change how people develop through life, that developmental cascade. So it bumps people towards certain developmental skills or assets or milestones quicker or slower, or to more positive or more problematic directions as well. So thank you very much for sharing that. That's really relevant. All right, so effortful control. So you might have heard of the marshmallow experiment. Give a child one marshmallow. The experimenter leaves, says, hey, if you wait till I come back, I'll give you 2 extra marshmallows. And so effortful control is something that children, not usually in infancy, are developing, but in very early childhood. And effortful control is really relevant to things like the prefrontal cortex and literally your effortful control of your own behaviors. And if children are really good with effortful control, they tend to also be better with things like managing their time and goal setting later on. And so it can be a really good skill to teach. And it's not just something that's innate. Teaching and helping train and encourage effortful control, and encouraging them when they're supposed to do one task and they're ignoring something else. So there's times when one of my children has to maybe do a chore, but their sibling is watching a show that they really like. So if they have that effortful control to pick up their shoes or something like that, encouraging that, reinforcing that can be really good for building that effortful control. So with that, self-regulation, that's the word I was looking for. It really helps with self-regulation and emotion regulation. So one thing with Rothbard and Bates classifications in these ways, and that's the only one I want to dive into in detail right now, is that original temperament researchers thought that, well, you had an easy child or a difficult child, and that was it. That's how they were going to be. But Rothbard and Bates realized, well, you can change. You can have gain more effortful control. You can have more extroversion. You can build those skills as an infant, as a young child. So that's one thing that has changed a lot in developmental research, is realizing that at basically any point, many things can change. So while you might have been extroverted, you might now be introverted, as an example. Or you might have lost some skills of effortful control or gained some skills of effortful control. So, here's the picture. I knew I had it here somewhere. So here's the child. We're talking about their temperament here and maybe other traits of their personality. There's also their biology to be concerned with, and their own choices, what they're doing. And these examples that we've been talking about are really great examples of, well, what could have a school network done for maybe the babysitting child example, or what could the parent network do to make it different? You could have another bubble here for the babysitter, especially if they're with them very often. And there's all these bidirectional arrows, because each individual affects every other individual, and each setting affects people in different ways. So developmental research tries to look at that, and that's a lot of variables. So it's a hard task to figure out, well, how can we best support a twin with their other twin as they go into school to help them make new friends and form good attachments and form positive skills and be better with social interaction, things like that. So just that simple thing is, well, not really a simple thing. That's one maybe more simple piece of just looking at that school network here, interacting with a child. But there's also other things like their social network, the parents' interaction. So where do you intervene? Where is the most important? What is the most detrimental risk factors? Maybe we should focus on those. What are the best protective factors? Maybe we should focus on those. So finding those and trying to do applied research to work with children to improve things or reduce risk factors is really what applied developmental science is all about. So hopefully that's becoming a lot more clear to you now. I know we've seen these models a couple times. All right, we talked about the sense of self and that theory of mind, that's what it's called, and theory of mind a little bit last time. There's one test you can do. If you know a young child or infant, you might want to try it. It's kind of interesting. So one test to see if a child recognizes that they are an individual is you can put a dot, say like a sticker or a marker, put a dot on like their nose or their head, and then have them put them in front of a mirror. So if the child touches the doll on their own face, so if they go and try to rub it off their own nose as they're looking in the mirror, that suggests to researchers that they know that that person in the mirror is them. Versus if they try to touch it in the mirror, they might not know that that person in the mirror is them. And that suggests a little bit about what is their sense of self and their understanding of their self. And it's kind of a funny thing to watch too. For very young children, they usually don't get the task right, versus older or closer to age 2 usually do. So we had a giant mirror in our house when my children were really young, and so they were really familiar with it because basically they would be crawling past it all the time. So they actually did this task earlier on. So it's not the perfect study, because if a child has more experience with the mirror, maybe they understand that difference and that person in the mirror is them a little earlier. But yeah, it is an interesting test. So let's move on to attachment, because I really do want to get to this activity. So what is the relevance of this monkey in this picture? What is the study that this came from? Does anybody remember?
I think they took them away from the mother when they were very young, and made one like metal, mother made of metal, and the other one with cloth. And they were most attached to the one that had the cloth with it. The researchers will go and scare them and see where they went to get like secure, and then most of them went to the cloth mother.
Yeah, very good description. That's exactly right. This study was done at a time in psychology where there was kind of an argument. Is it all behaviorism and reinforcement and instinct? Is that why people are attached to, say, their caregiver? Or is there other socio-emotional things that make people attached? So one of the metal monkey was just basically wire. You can actually see it here. So they had one monkey mother that was just this wire. But on that monkey mother, it had nipples with milk. So that was the only place the baby monkeys could feed. Versus this one, just like you said, it was warmer, it was covered in cloth. There's actually a light bulb inside it, so it was literally warmer, more close to like a monkey's body temperature. But obviously, it's not interacting with them. But there's one that is warm and soft, and there's one that has the food. And so some of the researchers thought that, well, it would focus on the one with the food because that's where it's getting nourishment. It needs nourishment to survive. That's the monkey it's going to focus on. But what we found is, just like you said, usually those monkeys ran to the soft one. They would spend most of their time with the soft mother, and they would be more attached to it. So here's a little graph of that. So there was a lot more time spent on the cloth mother versus the time spent with the wire mother. Basically, they would only feed on the wire mother and then jump to the cloth mother. So that really showed us that, well, there is a bigger impact of socio-emotional factors in any kind of attachment than researchers had thought previously. It was a good experiment to show that. So that attachment is that close emotional bond between two people. So we've mentioned it in relation to siblings today. We've mentioned it in relationships to mothers. Usually the studies of attachment are on mothers rather than fathers or grandparents or like caregivers like babysitters, but there have been a few of those done, and the findings tend to be really similar in attachments. So usually these studies are about mothers, but it can be any other close person. You probably have an attachment to siblings or a partner as well, and so that'll be relevant as we talk about attachment as well. So these are the phases. Your book talks about some phases, but these are the more updated phases for a more updated research. So we're not going to read over each of these, but if you're interested in attachment, knowing these phases in more detail is probably better for you. But this is actually from a grad school paper, my notes on that paper, so we won't go into a ton of detail. The main thing I want to talk about is the strange situation study. Hopefully you read about it in your book, and so you already kind of know what's happening, but it's an observational measure that requires an infant to go through a series of interactions with a parent and a stranger. So what happens is, first you get the parent. So usually it's a mother, but this has also been done with fathers, but usually it's done with mothers. So you bring in the mother and the child, and they play in this room. It's usually a lab at a university that they've put some baby toys and like pictures on the walls, things like that. And then after a little while of playing together, a stranger comes in, one of the researchers basically, comes in, talks to the kid, talks to the parent, but just kind of is there. And then the parent, the caregiver, leaves. And so you watch to see, well, what was their interactions like with the caregiver here? What were the interactions like between the child and the caregiver here? Then what does the child do when the parent leaves? After that, after some time, the parent will come back. Then depending on, there's a couple different variations, but the caregiver might leave the child all alone, or they might leave again. And then usually they have the stranger be with the child again by themselves, so the lab assistant. So you can imagine this is kind of similar to leaving a child with a babysitter that they don't know, but it gives in a really short time. So this usually takes between 20 and 40 minutes. In that short span of time, you can get a really good sense of the attachment style between the parent and the child versus Mary Ainsworth did a lot of in-home visits. So spending an entire day or multiple days with a parent and their child in their own home, and came up with the attachment styles, then realizing, hey, a whole day with a family is a lot to get that piece of data of knowing what attachment style. So she developed this kind of study to figure it out in a lot shorter time, this 20 minutes. So a securely attached child, generally we see that as the most positive and related to the most positive outcomes, so correlated with the most positive outcomes. The securely attached child will use the caregiver as a secure base, so they might go out and explore but then come back. They will probably cry when the parent leaves, but they can really quickly reestablish a positive interaction when the caregiver comes back. They might even be crying the whole time the caregiver is gone, but they can really quickly reestablish positive interactions, still use that caregiver as a secure base, and then go out and explore again. Oftentimes they'll go back to playing. So that's securely attached. And we're actually going to watch a couple quick videos of a couple of these, well, clips of the strange situation. And in groups, I'm going to want you to come up with, well, is this securely attached? Is this insecurely attached? So maybe writing some notes right now of some things to be watching for would be good. But again, it's usually 15 to 40 minutes. We're going to watch like 3 minutes of clips from interactions. All right, so insecure avoidant. So the child will show insecurity by avoiding the caregiver. They might not be trying to play with the caregiver at the very beginning, have very little interactions. They tend not to be very distressed when the caregiver leaves, so not crying. They're kind of indifferent, so they're avoiding contact with the caregiver. And they often don't try to reestablish contact when the caregiver returns. So the caregiver is back now. It's like, well, whatever, it doesn't really matter. And so this kind of attachment might come because they know that they cannot rely on the caregiver in many instances, or it's so, that might lead to an insecure avoidant attachment. Insecure resistant is again an insecure attachment, but it's a little different. They'll be clinging to the caregiver. So at the beginning, they might not be going around playing. They might be just clinging to them, but they also might resist that closeness. So maybe when the parent comes back, they'll run over to them really quickly, but then kind of push them away. That's possible as well. They often don't explore the room. They'll be very distressed when the caregiver leaves, and then very hard to soothe, even when it's the caregiver that comes back. So sometimes with a insecure avoidant or securely attached child, the stranger can actually soothe them when the parent leaves. But for an insecure resistant child, the stranger, the caregiver, basically nobody will be able to comfort them. And so this kind of attachment style might come from a parent who gives very irregular support to their child. So maybe it might be That's a really good question. Can attachment styles change if parents change their parenting style? Yes, absolutely. So your attachment style, for most people, parents kind of parent the same way, like through a child's childhood. And then, so for most people, they keep the same attachment style. But if a parent does change their parenting style, it absolutely can change a child's attachment style, for sure. Your attachment style can also change later on in life, but we'll come to that point after we do the activity too. So it's not a fixed, immovable thing forever. Also, for a child who's adopted, they might have an insecure. For an adopted child who, or a foster child who wasn't really given much care and concern and warmth, they might be more likely to be insecure avoidant. But then, whatever the new foster family or the adoptive family was, they might then develop a secure attachment. That would be the hope, really. There's also insecure disorganized. It's a really rare one. Basically, it's a category of behaviors that don't really fit the other categories that they kind of threw together as another category at the time. Like, I don't know what to do with these. Since then, there have been more breakdowns of each of these categories. And also, insecure disorganized has kind of been broken up into more specific categories of attachment. But for our purposes, this is sufficient for now. Understanding the secure attachment, the insecure avoidant, and the insecure resistant. So why is attachment important? Well, we've been talking about it all day. It's this foundation for a healthy socio-emotional relationship. So infants, like we talked about, learn how to regulate their emotions because of the warmth and responsiveness of their parents. If that parent is not warm and responsive or is doing warm, responsive behaviors very irregularly, they might not be able to be learning how to regulate their emotions as well or as early. It also helps develop those neural pathways for how do we interact with people, or how should we expect people should interact with us. So if you are insecurely avoidantly attached to your caregivers, you might expect that you cannot have support from people. That might be what you learn as a child, that you can't really expect things from people. And so that would be that could lead to a lot of things later on in life too. Make it more difficult to have strong socio-emotional attachments. Also, I thought we made this point later, but it's here on the slides now. While your attachment style in childhood tends to stay consistent through childhood, you also tend to find a romantic partner later on in life who shares that same attachment style. So if you're securely attached, you're expecting things from secure and close relationships. You're expecting warmth, support, someone who's a secure base that you can talk to. But if you're insecure avoidant, that's what you've learned to expect. And so two people who have secure attachment will tend to come together in a partnership. People with insecure avoidant attachments will tend to come together in a dating relationship. So, and it's not like 100% of the time that's going to happen. But that tends to be the case. And so if you imagine that you've got two insecurely avoidant people together in a relationship, that's going to be a harder relationship. That being said, they could both together develop a secure attachment to each other and then completely change their attachment styles. What's more common though is that someone in like their early 20s, they have a partner that was securely attached to their parents, but they themselves were insecurely attached to theirs. So the insecure person and the securely attached person come together, and so the insecure person learns, oh, this is how a securely attached relationship is supposed to be. So most often in around the early 20s, that's how people change their attachment styles, is being partnered with a securely attached person. So it can definitely change, not even just in childhood, but also through adulthood as well. So that's plasticity for you. Both neurological changes, so now you're literally expecting neurologically a secure attachment with your partner versus before you might not have been because that's not what you had with your parents. So yeah, that can lead to more positive outcomes later on in the future. So going back to developmental cascades, while you might be at risk for certain things because of insecure attachments early on, if those things change later on, it can lead to more positive outcomes. So Every individual can change their attachment, but for about 75% of people, we tend to keep our same attachments through life, and it doesn't change. But for about 25, just naturally tend to, you can also intentionally change it. Oh no, my internet says it's disconnected. Is everybody still here?
Yeah, you just cut it for like a second and came back.
Okay, perfect. That's good. I was afraid that maybe it had been a minute or so as I'm just keeping talking. All right, so hopefully you understand a little better about the attachment styles now. So we are going, so again, insecure, disorganized. Don't worry about that one. None of these examples are disorganized. But look over insecure, resistant really quickly again. So resisting closeness, but wanting that closeness. Hard to soothe when the caregiver comes back. Insecure, avoidant. They'll often avoid the caregiver. When the caregiver comes back, they might not even want to reestablish contact. It's like they don't even care. Secure attachment, they use the caregiver as a secure base, go out and explore. They might cry, but then they get comforted when the caregiver comes back, and they can usually get back to playing. So watch for those behaviors as we do a group activity. So right now, it looks like we have most of the class. So 3, 4. And it looks like your names are kind of spread throughout. All right, so what I think we should do, I think we have enough people. What we'll do together is we will watch each video together in this room in just a second and take some notes while we're doing that. So we'll all just stay in this room for this couple minutes while we watch these 2 videos. And then after we watch those 2 videos and you've taken notes, we're not going to really talk to our group yet. But after we do that, I want you to click over here on Teams, and then hopefully you're seeing this right now. Click whichever group it corresponds to the letter of your last name. So mine is R, and that would be here, right? BQR. So actually, no, this would be my room. So since my last name starts with R, I would jump in here. And then with your group there, either in the chat or with video chat, discuss what kind of attachment style was video 1 and why, what pieces of evidence did you see for that, and then what attachment style was example 2, what pieces of evidence did you see there, and just talk about it, discuss together, see if someone thinks it was different, ask them why, and see if they're right, see if they're not. So hopefully you've covered attachment styles both in the chapter as well as right now. I gave you a couple hopefully pretty clear examples, but now we are ready to watch these. But are there questions? And then after we talk for like 5 minutes in our groups, we'll come back here and see what all the groups decided the example 1 was and the example 2 was. So questions about what we're doing? Did everybody see where to go to the groups? All right, so I will turn these on. All right, hopefully this works. Darn it. Sometimes it just doesn't want to play by itself. I'm going to open it up in my actual PowerPoint file. Sometimes it doesn't like to open from the PDF file. I don't know why. I don't think PDFs like to store links to videos in the way I set it up. So let me open it really quick. All right, slide 473. Let's scroll down to that. All right, this should work now. Where is my display? Oh, that's not what I want. my preview option? For some reason, it changed my menu. So all the icons are in a slightly different place now.
I think under the slideshow tab.
Yeah, that works. Perfect. Thank you. All right, so let's watch these examples.
The caregiver then leaves and the stranger interacts with the baby.
Mommy will be back. Come. Mommy will be back. Let's play together. It's okay. Mommy will be back. Oh, I know. Mommy will be back. It's okay. It's okay. Shall we play with the toys? Shall we play with the toys? Huh? Do you want to sit on here? Yeah? Yeah? Okay. Come on. One foot up. One foot up. And up you go. Now you're on a truck. Now you're on a truck. And you can push. Can you push? You want him to ride with you? I know. She'll be back. Oh, no. Oh. Mommy will be back. Mommy's coming now. Mommy's coming back. Mommy's going to come back.
The caregiver signals her return and enters.
Caroline. Hi. Hi, sweetie. Did you miss Mommy? Did you miss Mommy?
Reunites with the baby and interacts with the baby while the stranger
Are you
leaves.
making a sign for Mama's milk? Yeah. Yeah, it's not time for that right now. But we can play with some toys. Let's play with some toys. Do you see a big dinosaur? And do you see a tiger? Let's see if we can find the tiger. Huh? Hi.
All right, so even though we're not going to jump into our groups right now, take some notes really quickly about some things that you saw there, and we will watch the next one in just a minute. But just take some quick notes that you can share with your group. What attachment style did you think that was? What specific pieces of evidence did you think were the reason for that? And then we'll break up into groups in a minute after we do the same thing for another video. So I'll give you like a minute to write some notes. All right, so finish up your notes and we're going to watch another example of the strange situation. So again, watch for specific behaviors between the parent and the child and the stranger that might indicate what kind of attachment style this one is.
She's ready to answer. She's ready to answer. Okay. You know how to play? No? I did. Yeah. Let's play with the cards, that's another. You have your fun? The baby? And you know the baby? What's the baby's name? You want to take care of it? Hi, Destiny. Good. Hi, Destiny. 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 Hey, Destiny. You having fun?
All right, so that was the second example. So now take a minute to write notes, and as you're writing notes, jump into your separate group meetings. So again, to find those, click on the Teams icon, and then you can go to whichever group corresponds to your last name. So mine would be this group. So jump into there as you finish writing your notes, and then we will come back all together at, let's say 9:27, but maybe we'll just say 9:30. Yeah, let's say 9:30. We'll all come back together in the general meeting room. Okay, good. Yeah, 9:30 would be great. So jump into your small groups and talk about, for example, 1, which attachment style did you think that displayed, and attachment 2, or example 2, which attachment style did that display? And maybe you will need to even open up your slides to look at insecure avoidant, insecure resistant, and secure attachment if you need to remind yourself as well. All right, let's see if I can get everybody back now and we can talk about it. All right, there's a few that look like they're still coming back. Let's see if I can just force them back. All right, it looks like everybody's coming back. We've got maybe one or two who are not. So let's talk about this. Oh, I didn't mention to try and make a spokesperson or something like that. But hopefully there's a couple members of the groups who would like to share what they figured out, which attachment styles they thought examples were and were. So for example 1, do we have anyone who thinks they're pretty clear, or their group was all pretty clear about what this first attachment style was?
Yes. That was only me on my group, so I'm the spoken person.
Oh, I'm sorry. If that ever happens again, so in the future for other group activities, if you're the only one in there, you can maybe just put a comment, oh, I don't see anyone here, I'm jumping to this group, and just jump into another group with more people. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
But yeah,
But-
go for it.
The first one seems like a secure attachment because she explores the room while the mother is there, and even though like when she leaves, the stranger tries to soothe her, and when the mother comes back, she goes and hugs the mother, and she wants to be with the mother, and once the strangers leave, she goes and explores the room again. So there are all signs of secure attachment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good observations there. Was there anyone in any of the other groups that disagreed, that thought it was a different kind of attachment? I know there was one group talking about it as an insecure type of attachment, but I don't know if they came to, in the end, decide on secure.
Okay, so I was with one other human and we talked about it and we thought it was insecure resistant.
Mm-hmm.
But now I don't know.
Yeah, what were some of the pieces of evidence that you saw that would suggest that it was resistant to your group?
Well, just the way that the kiddo was kind of like, they did run to the parent and want to be with the parent, but then also in their arms seemed a little bit like resistant, and then also the way that they just were unhappy the whole time. But you did say that secure attachment kiddos could be stressed the whole time their caregiver is gone. So I don't know, actually.
Yeah, no, those are really great observations. You picked up on a couple of the things that might suggest, for both of you, you picked up on different things that might suggest that it's secure versus resistant. So very good. So yeah, the behavior when the caregiver came back specifically was cited as something that might suggest resistant attachment. So they ran to the caregiver, they hugged, but they didn't ever really push away, but they were still definitely stressed during that time. Even when the caregiver was holding, the caregiver tried to put them down on a toy, and they still seemed stressed. They really wanted to cling to that caregiver. So I could definitely see how you might say, well, that might be indicative of this insecure resistant attachment. So very good. One thing that you might pick up on that might suggest secure attachment was the child was asking for mama's milk. So it was doing a sign, like the patting on the mother was actually a sign for mama's milk. I don't know if the audio came through well enough to hear that, but that would suggest secure attachment. It wants that kind of comfort and closeness from feeding. So all of the behaviors put together, those specific examples were really good and suggest maybe resistant, but I think all put together, secure attachment fits this example the best. That they were able to calm down, even though it took a little bit when the parent came back, and the child was able to get back into playing with toys. So definitely a weakness of seeing such a short interaction. There are definitely some things that might suggest secure, might suggest resistant. And so this is something that happens in developmental research. When you have researchers, so in this case, we were all the researchers, we were all the observers. So we all watched this interaction and we have to determine which behaviors were secure or insecure, resistant or avoidant. So that's what we would do as a group. We would see if we all agree. And if everybody agrees, well, then it's really easy. It's pretty clear then in that case, probably that it's secure attachment. But in this case, there were some clear pieces of evidence that might suggest that it was a resistant. So the original video that I pulled it from said it was also secure attachment. And watching the whole thing, it was a lot more clear. But in the class activity, I've got to cut it down a little shorter. But some really good observations there from everyone. All right, so example number 2. I don't think, yeah, it doesn't have the actual preview there, but it was the second example we watched. Anybody's group agree and want to share what they thought attachment example 2 was?
For me, it looked like it was avoidant, insecure avoidant attachment. Because she didn't really care when the mother was there. She was just doing her thing, and then the stranger comes in, she didn't really get stressed about it. And when the mother comes back, she didn't even go close to the mother, like she was not there at all. So that for me was signs of avoidant attachment.
Yeah, really good examples there. I think those are pretty clear signs of maybe avoidant attachment. Was there any other groups that thought something different? Or did everybody agree on avoidant in this case? Oh, we've got a comment. So agreed. Yeah. From what I heard, and obviously I didn't hear all the conversations, it seemed like everyone was pretty set on insecure avoidant. And I agree. Those specific examples of observations that you cited, I think show that insecure avoidant attachment. They weren't really distressed by the caregiver leaving. They didn't try to reestablish contact. It seems like they might have cared more about the stranger that just left, the stranger who had been playing with them. So hopefully from these interactions, you can see maybe some of what might be going on at home with the children. So the first child seems to be securely attached. The second child seems to be insecure avoidant. So maybe that first child does get a lot more quick responsiveness. Maybe the second child doesn't get as quick responsiveness. Maybe they have to play on their own a lot, and they're not having immediate care. And that could come from a lot of things. Like one, it could come from a parent's choice, but two, maybe the second parent is working 2 or 3 jobs just to be able to feed their child and keep a roof over their heads. And so they aren't able to be there to respond as quickly. So maybe the child has multiple other caregivers for no fault of the parents. So there's a lot of different contextual factors that might lead to these attachments. It's not just parenting style. It's not just temperament of the child. There's also external factors that neither the parent nor the child can control. So hopefully this gives you a better sense of how all of the systems interact. Let's jump over to the slides and the pictures. So hopefully that shows you it's not just the child, it's not just the parent. There are all these other contextual factors that can affect how a child develops over time. So a child with an insecure avoidant attachment, they will be likely to seek out a romantic partner later in life who also has an insecure avoidant attachment. And that can be a more challenging relationship than 2 securely attached individuals coming together. So it can definitely work, and they can definitely change each other's attachment styles too to securely attached. But this is what we're talking about with developmental cascades, is that different aspects can change in life and change kind of trajectories, add more risk factors, add more protective factors. And I've mentioned those words a couple times. I don't remember if I've ever defined them. A risk factor is basically something that's correlated or has been known to cause maybe potential negative outcomes, or that it's more likely that there might be negative outcomes because of this risk factor. So smoking is a risk factor for lung cancer, for example. That's an example of a causal relationship, though. Protective factors are are basically the opposite. So a protective factor is something in the context, something in the situation, something in the parent or the child that protects from negative outcomes. So it's correlated with positive outcomes, correlated with thriving. So not smoking is correlated with healthier lungs, for example. So not smoking would be a protective factor, or moving to a new house, or moving to maybe a new school with more resources might be a protective factor from some things. Having a school climate change to be more positive might be a protective factor for bullying. So protect against that kind of risk. So that's what protective factor, that's what risk factors are. I don't remember if I had ever defined those. But hopefully this helps you see the interaction between so many different systems and how they're relevant. So if you want to see the last example, feel free to watch that. It looks like the ODP file, so basically the PowerPoint file, should work with that. And let's continue on. That's one of the main things I want to get from this infant socio-emotional development chapter. Oh, here's the picture of developmental cascades again. So the social context an individual is in is really important to their development over time. And so hopefully that's getting drilled into your heads now. So I hope also you can see that it's not so stage-like we mentioned Piaget last time. You probably read a lot about Piaget and its stages in the book. But rather than being so stage-like, things like attachment can change throughout life. While it usually does get pretty set in early childhood, and infancy before the age of 2, and tends to stay the same, it doesn't for everybody. So things can change in their systems. So each person is actually a relational developmental system in and of themselves. So that's a lot of big words. So an individual can relate to other individuals. They are developing, and they themselves are a system of complex interactions, their health, their biology, their neurology, their hormones, their temperament, their personality. All these things are interacting. They're a system in and of themselves, but they're working within other systems around them. So, I mean, if you put it really quickly, everything affects everything is one thing that developmental research has learned. And it's really neat and it's really complicated to figure out exactly what we can do to help at different times in life. If it was all just stages and it's like, well, we get someone to this stage and then they can move on to the next stage, that's a lot easier sounding. But that's not actually how things work, how people develop. So another way of looking at that bidirectional relationship can be seen here. So the marital relationship, for example, might affect the way that these parents parent. It might affect the way the child develops and behaves towards the parent, which might then again affect that marital relationship. The relationship of parents might then directly affect that child. So these cyclical relationships between things are how development is happening over time. So child interacts with parent, parent interacts with child might interact with a marriage relationship, which interacts with child. So basically any relational developmental system will interact with any relational developmental system. So hopefully that's broken down that complexity of the model that we saw like day one, and you kind of understand what's going on at that micro level. And that's where most studies look at, something like attachment, and then the parent will do maybe surveys while they're outside the room. The child's behavior, is the child prosocial or not? Is the child having problem behaviors or not? Things like that, to see correlations between this attachment style and other things. So that we can learn at a micro level and kind of expand it with other research that other people are doing and apply it to our own to figure out what the big picture is as well. So many of these things we have talked about. Scaffolding we haven't mentioned specifically by name. Scaffolding is essentially building on, maybe we have talked about it one of the first days. Scaffolding is essentially building on a child's capacities starting at where they are now. So if they have a certain capacity in math for an early child, building on that from that place. So you don't want them to jump like 2 steps above or like to calculus when they're still having trouble adding and subtracting. So you start with like adding and subtracting 1 number, then 2 numbers, then 3 numbers. Start with money is what my daughter is doing right now, after she's done enough numbers that way. So building on those things like a stair step. So in that way, it's kind of stage-like, but it's coming down to the child's level. That's what scaffolding is. You can think of a scaffolding for building a building. You're starting probably at a foundation level and then building the building up, and the scaffolding is going up with it. That's what scaffolding is for a child's development. With this child care in the U.S., many U.S. children have multiple caregivers. So over 2 million children receive formal licensed care from like a care professional, but many, many more children are cared for by babysitters, family friends, grandparents, aunts and uncles, like a family member that's able to take while the parent is working generally. So with that, many children don't have quality formal non-parental care. So only 12% of these licensed programs, so only 12% of those licensed programs were considered high quality based on what the expectations are for reducing risk factors and increasing protective factors. So that's not very much. So if you have the option of a couple different childcare kind of facilities, researching them, figuring out which one's best can be a daunting task, especially because they probably aren't publishing data. Some do, but it's hard to find high quality ones. So these are some articles on what makes a high quality childcare program. And so this is relevant for infants as well as early childhood and into middle childhood as well. So quality early childcare, some of the big bullet points to remember and I want you to take away from class are a low teacher and child ratio. So 1 teacher to fewer numbers of children. So 4 would be great. If you have 1 teacher to like 30 kids, that can be a lot more difficult. It's harder to scaffold each of those individuals and their own needs when you have too many kids to take care of. Age appropriate learning activities. So for an infant, blocks or something like that. For someone 8 years old, books that they can read, math puzzles, maybe even online tools that they might have access to. Engaging in safe learning environments, so engaging activities, things that the kids actually want to and like to do. Activities that support both their physical development, their social development, and their emotional development. So games, for example, dodgeball might, I mean, as long as you're doing it safely, might give you a chance to have that physical development, some social interaction, and emotional growth. So you'll probably lose at some point. I know my youngest is still having trouble when losing a game to be okay with that. Sometimes the game just ends right there. I feel that way when I play Monopoly, honestly, even as an adult. So also qualified staff that have developmental opportunities for additional training, because we're learning more about development all the time. So having staff that can get more training, so the company or organization providing that training for them, giving them money to go to, say, a conference or a specific training, and then hiring staff that have good training or training them well when they come on. Those are some of the key core components to look for good quality early child care. Yeah, good. That's the main thing I wanted to get across at the end of this socio-emotional chapter. Are there questions or comments about anything so far? I know we kind of sped through the last bit of that content. Oh, right, study guide. I will pull that up really quick to answer that question. Good question. Oh, there it was. Okay, well, this one actually has the answers on it, but that's okay. So the test is not a carbon copy of this section of the study guide. It is very, very similar to this lower section of the study guide. So where's mine that doesn't have answers? Oh, that's the actual exam, which I'm sure you would like to see. Here we go. There's the one that doesn't have the answers highlighted. So these first questions up here basically suggest that there's more than one multiple choice question on these topics. So how are epigenetics related to development through the lifespan? That's a really general question, but you can know that there's multiple choice questions about that topic. So reviewing this might suggest, oh, I don't really remember epigenetics. So maybe reviewing that section in the lecture, reviewing it in the book, reviewing it in your notes, so you would be ready for that. the exam itself looks pretty much exactly like 10 through 18 here. Multiple choice questions, generally 4 possible answers per. There tends to be, most are a reasonable difficulty, not super hard, not very easy, but then there's about 10% of the questions that are really, really easy, that if you've been even half awake the whole time reading or doing lectures, you'll get. Then there are about 10% that are a little more difficult. So I put a couple of those more difficult questions here in the study guide. So if you're able to answer all of these really easily, you'll probably be able to answer all the questions on the exam really easily. So pretty much carbon copy of 10 through 18, but just 60 questions like that. So good question. Hopefully that answers the question as well. All right, well, that is the end of class. If you still have a couple questions, I do have a few minutes before my next class that I can answer a few more, but I'll stop the recording and let anybody go that needs to go. So thank you for being here today.